I'm always a woman, you know. I never leave being a woman. So that shows one way or another in the painting. But who is a woman? I really like working alone. I like being able to be in the studio, nobody here, put on the music, you know, and to create an envelope of time and space that's just between me and the painting. You know, what's happening there and what's happening there. And it's a conversation that you have with your painting, always, because you put something down and it tells you something that you didn't know before you got it down there on the canvas. And then you get it down and it's there and it talks to you. And it tells you what else you need. And then you go to the next stage. So it is that kind of back and forth that happens between you and the canvas, which is totally engaging always. I don't dislike art that was made in the 18th or the 19th century. I grew up, you know, when I first saw those works in slides, I was knocked over. It's part of why I became an artist, because I loved everything from the Egyptians on down. So it's all part of who I am also. And they can't take that away from me and tell me I can't use that anymore. And I'm part of the main culture, but I am always a woman. And I bring, as a woman, other things to the work that maybe wasn't there before. Some of it is sheer rebelliousness, you know, is just a kind of confrontation with life, with things that are wrong in the world that you want to fix somehow. And that sense of confronting and feeling that you could have to do something, I think gives you the confidence to push ahead. Part of it was sheer survival instinct of you had to be doing things to survive, so that pushed you forward. And I don't know that it was just that, but the confidence was perhaps coming from a home where you were nurtured emotionally. I lived in Madrid. I went to Madrid. I was an abstract expressionist, and I had a whole career there. I was there for 7.5 years, and the work was exhibited, and I traveled with the work to South America. It was exhibited in a museum there. So I had a whole background of a different kind of work, but living in Europe, in Madrid particularly, because Spain at that time was still Franco Spain. That was very much a certain kind of sexual and religious repression in that area. I started to understand how many of the things that I had to fight for to survive as a professional woman were really problematic institutionally in the whole structure of society. So I sort of became a feminist there, where things were so extreme that you didn't accept them as normal. Whereas in the States, the way we lived, it seemed to me that was just the way things were. It wasn't as if I could see that they needed to be changed necessarily. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I couldn't feel comfortable being myself under those conditions. So that was the background that forced a kind of change. And then I returned to this country right at the time when the women's movement was really coming into its own. And that was very important for me because I came with my consciousness already raised. I didn't need to sit through those kind of consciousness raising sessions. I understood what all that was about, how things needed to change right from the very beginning. And I felt that the change needed to start in the sexual area. And so they were political meetings, essentially, of artists. And there were many women there who then split off from the main group. They got tired of being the coffee carriers, for the men. And they realized that the problems that they had were distinctive and different from the men's, and they had problems with those very men who were male artists in terms of being seen as equal and as complete artists in the same way, with the same kind of drives. So that was the way it began. I think that the artist in Western society, more here in America probably than Europe, were seen as effeminate, right? They weren't real men in a certain sense. They liked culture, and they weren't the cowboy kind of image. And so that their whole sense of themselves as artists had to be defended, their sense of themselves as men, and that men made the culture, that men were the ones who women made babies and men made culture, and the whole nature-culture kind of dichotomy came into play in that. And women were part of nature. They're like beasts, the breeders, right? So that set up, to begin with, that whole kind of discrimination against women artists, that they weren't. They didn't have the kind of muscular gesture to be able to make really strong work. They made work that was pretty. When I went to Spain, and I invited some male artists to my studio, they came because I was pretty, and they thought, and I thought, well, whatever they thought, I know. But they came and saw the work, and they said, wow, we thought we were coming to see pictures of flowers, right? And what was there was the Maya X pictures, which were also very strong, So there was always that expectation that the women would do things that were very feminine and were, quote, weak, and not masculine. The men were the painters or sculptors who made muscular, strong, breakthrough work and determined the culture. The women's groups that got together, we tried to find what there was in our work that was distinctive and different than what was in the men's work, because they were always telling us it was not, and there were differences in the work. There actually were. There were certain themes that came through all the time. The men had the exclusive kind of right to do a certain kind of muscular painting. Don't forget, it was a period of abstract expressionism, and you saw that kind of expression of energy that was supposedly the province of men. The women, in reaction to all of that, decided that what the women did was different. But any of the work that was done in that way was immediately branded as not good enough, right? And the women did really interesting work that was considered eccentric and not mainstream. And so the women were determined to make it mainstream, you know, that it was just as mainstream as what the men were doing. It just was different. And the men didn't understand it. So there was a kind of reaction. It was a kind of reactive response to that whole syndrome of a certain kind of painting, the only kind of painting being mainstream and everything else being excluded. It was a reactive thing, so that then you weren't supposed to make painting, right? That was what men did. You're supposed to make all kinds of strange stuff. And you certainly weren't supposed to make nudes. And part of that was about breaking down the canon of what the history of art gave us as the canon of high art. And anything else was craft or not high art. We had to fight very hard to break it down. And there were, you know, deliberate push to do art that was everything that was exactly what they criticized us for being. They said it was decorative, so we had a whole period of decoration and patterning where the women, you know, were leaders in that field. And like I say, in the sculptural area, things that were made out of weaving and textile and so on, that all of that became the domain that the women excelled in, and that was pushed as feminist art. Consequently, if you made painting, why are you competing in their territory? It's their territory, and we don't want to deal with their territory. We don't want their territory to be high art. We want our territory to be high art. So it was that kind of thing. And the same thing with the nude. The nude was always made for the male gaze. We didn't have the word the male gaze then, right? But that's what I was dealing with. I mean, I was deliberately distracting the nude from the male gaze to bring it into what the female saw. I loved color. I loved being free in color. I only moved away from the color, from the abstraction, because I was so intent on making the image that gave the content that I cared about. And as I started to work the nude, I needed to gradually make it more and more naturalistic, so that it registered the way I wanted it to, and not registered as something out of, like, say, German Expressionist art, right? So I gradually moved more towards a more photographic kind of color, right? But I never gave it up. I always loved that color, and I always wanted to find a way to be able to use the color together with the kind of image that I needed to say what I had to say. And that's part of why the late paintings are probably one of the strongest groups that I have, because I finally figured out how to do it in a way that both registered, both the content and the image, plus the abstraction and the color that I always like to use. I always want a painting to have what I call bite, you know, to not be too pretty, to not be just beautiful. It has to have an edge of some kind to satisfy me. So if I lose the edge and it just becomes, a kind of aesthetic experience without any edge, that doesn't satisfy me. When you worked on something that you couldn't make it happen and suddenly you find the way. And you say, oh my God, look what I did. Isn't that wonderful? And that's the pleasure of it, the magic of it. It's always magical. I mean, I want to have an aesthetic experience. I don't want to be deliberately ugly, right? But like I say, it has to have some provocation in it. That provocation for me is not grotesquerie, right? I mean, there's a lot of art that works with, it's almost like in literature would be a horror story, right? In painting, it's about making things that are really repulsive almost, either in content or in actual image. But it's not my nature, I suppose, to respond particularly to that kind of thing. So I still look for the aesthetic kind of experience of pleasure in the color, pleasure in the form, in how things hold together. They're more, the pieces, I think I've always thought of it more as iconic image rather than a narration. I want not the story to be told, I want the image to register. What I want it to be is about that image, and that the image registers. And that's the aesthetic experience, really, rather than the literal experience. So, in terms of the kind of thing that I've worked with, there's always the content, but it's not a narrative content. It's not a content about, oh, look, she's holding a camera, and yes, that's there, but it's the image of it, not the story of it. Destabilizing the view and the viewer. Who's looking at who, right? Which is part of what I started with, in a certain way, when I started working the nude, right? So one understood that in the history of art, the whole history of the female nude was displayed for the male viewer. I mean, you could never look at any of those paintings. I mean, I don't know how a gay woman might respond to that, but as a heterosexual woman, I know that those paintings were not for my gaze. So I wanted to make paintings that would engage a woman also, and that would be that the person that is described in the painting was not a passive subject. And so I was very deliberate in thinking about that. And of course, I used different devices to make that happen. One was the self-image looking down, then the use of the camera in the picture, right? It happened accidentally that I took pictures in the locker room that I was doing, and I was in the mirrors. So I used the mirrors, right? But I use what's available, and then I understand how it functions and if it works for me. And I use it because it works for me to do what I wanted to happen, for you to know that when you looked at it, that what you saw in the painting was not a passive subject. It was somebody and something was happening there that was an activity that took control of what you saw, not that just allowed itself to be seen. It's always about here I am, you know, and that self-determination was the intent of the paintings. It was the intent so far as I was concerned, but I wanted it to convey to other women that they have that same subjectivity rather than objectivity, to become also self-determining. When I used the mannequins, I was also interested in the way the fashion industry and the whole culture puts up a model of the female form that is arbitrary, to say the least, you know. And so I was playing with some of that, of the idea of the flesh as it actually is in a human being, and the model that one is supposed to conform to. So I have like several paintings of myself with the camera, and in the background is one of the mannequins, so that you see that juxtaposition, right? So it wasn't so much intended as a kind of surreal object, you know, that comes alive, you know, the doll that becomes the reality. But it was really more about a kind of mass production of a female form, of a pseudo-female form, for which everyone needs to conform. And men would say, you know, women they're all the same. I mean, all of the jokes were about women are all the same, you know. So that permeated everything. So that's what I was really working against at the thing. Of course, as I say, the way it came across in the end was that they felt surreal to people, because the faces really spoke of anxiety and unhappiness. You know, they were sad faces. The concept of a desirable woman that have been created by man, of what is a desirable woman, and take it to the utmost degree, it becomes a doll, right? That has no mind of its own, that does everything you would like it to do, that is beautiful to look at. That's what a doll is. You know, you press it and it says, "Ma."
It says, "Pa."
Pa. Total passivity. And also it gives you total control. And to love, to need total control of the thing or the person one loves is a very common kind of syndrome. You take a big risk to follow a dream, to follow what you want to be, and not a lot of men can deal with that. You know, they want you to conform to the norms that are very much in their favor, that your interest should be their interest, not your own. It's been a problem straight along for heterosexual women in that way, because we will still want to be loved by men. I mean, and what men want has to also change. And how can we make them change? So the only way, it seems, is to take the risk that they won't love you as you are. And that's a risk, and sometimes you lose. There are just so many different ways that you have to step out to live as an artist. I mean, when I first moved here, my mother thought I was doing something terrible, right? When I was young, to live alone as a woman was something that you shouldn't do, right? It was not proper. To divorce was terrible back then. Now it's perfectly normal, but back then it wasn't, right? To raise children in a place like this was not normal, right? So I was not a good mother. I was not a good wife, right? All of those things. So in every way, you're put into a box of what you can do and what you can't do, you know? And those restrictions become overbearing and change what you're able to do in a very real way, not just because they're external restrictions, they become internal, that you internalize those restrictions. And that internalization is crippling. How do you resist that? There are just, I don't know. I mean, I think young women now are a lot more rebellious than they used to be, but they still, you just look at what fashion does. All of the different elements in the society come together to make that formulation of following a certain path. And the amount of advertising and that goes on, what the greater culture now in terms of movies and television has such a formative kind of effect on people. But yet with it all, we still have tremendous group rebellions, starting with I don't know what happened before, but the hippies, for instance, that changed a lot of things. But that was changed because birth control happened, right? So, you know, things are changing now because more women have to work. They work. So once they work, if they bring home better salaries, if they have better jobs, it's in the men's interest, self-interest also. So they start approving those kinds of things. But then the workplace has to change. You know, the power disequilibrium has to change. All of those things have to change for women to be different. It isn't just one thing, you know? I think one of the things that has changed is because women work so much, you see men taking care of children sometimes. You never used to see that. You never saw a man carrying a baby and pushing a baby carriage. You know, a man simply wouldn't do that. It was unmanning him. So they do now. So they have contact with children now with some of the work that women do all the time. And that changes the way they see the women. And it changes the way the children see the men, right? So the next generation then is somewhat different in terms of what they consider normal. And it's a gradual kind of evolution. And there is that evolution. Women today are different than they were in my day. Not enough, not everywhere, but nevertheless, it's very different. Let me tell you, it's different. It's education from day one, you know, from in the bathroom where the baby is being bathed by the man rather than the woman, because the woman isn't home yet, right? It's all of those things change the way we see each other. And I think young men are a lot more open to women as people than they were, the young people. I mean, there's a lot of distortion around sex and pornography and all that kind of stuff. Those are big problem areas, I think. The sexual area is still a big problem. The women have internalized some of male desire, right? So that they don't understand the difference. And they think that as long as it's sexual and they're doing it, it's feminist. And they use some of the imagery that the men have used. They appropriate it. And they don't seem to feel that it is negative for themselves. I hesitate to even discuss it at times, because I feel that maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I come out of a different background, from a different time. Maybe that's a new evolution that I just can't relate to because of what I come through. I don't know. They have to find their own way of confronting those problems. I think some of it is just that they're young, and when they're young, they don't really, first of all, understand where the repression comes from or how it's repressive. They're just reacting to the desire, and their way of reacting to desire is by complying and buying into the kind of imagery that signifies desire in the larger culture. And they don't understand how those kind of signals are signals that are demeaning to them, or how to create signals that are not demeaning. You give them permission. That's all you can do. You give them permission to do things that are outrageous, and also you give them permission to fail. I mean, today, if you get a divorce, your mother doesn't say, "What did you do wrong?" Right? She says, "What did he do wrong?" There's a difference, and that's all you can do is that permission. You don't tell your child you have to do this or you have to do that. You let them be who they can be. That doesn't mean you don't, talk to them about the problems and whatever it is, but it's a different way of being. In my generation, you were steered very clearly into what you could do and what you could not do. I was told by my father a million times, "You can't do that, you're a woman." Right? He loved me. It wasn't that he was being mean. He was trying to help me, to be happy. "You'll never be happy doing that," he said. "A woman can't be happy that way." When he walked into this place, he said, "Oh my God, how did you do? You can't do this, you're a woman." I said, "I just did it, Daddy." So there's that. There's all that. But I think part of it is that you asked me before, how did I get the confidence, right? I know he would love me no matter what. So I knew I had that if I failed at something, he wouldn't stop loving me. Women today have a lot more possibilities for becoming themselves than at any time previously. So one has to take hope from that, and not feel like it's an impossible task. It's not impossible. It just means that people have to be conscious and have to work at it. It doesn't happen by itself. It means people have to stand up and push. And if they're not willing to take the risks, well, then they're going to lose. If I didn't have my art, right, what would I do? What would I be? It's part of my identity. So it identifies me to myself. This is who I am. And if I didn't have that, I might feel somewhat lost. I'm not having that sense of, this is who I am, this is my purpose, And this is what keeps me interested. Otherwise, I might be terribly bored at this time of my life specifically, right? Where my children are grown, my partner has died, I'm alone now, but I have my work. If I didn't have that, I would be afraid of that, yes. So that's something that we all seem to need. That sense of a meaningful life that gives one that feeling of having accomplished something and of being identified with something outside of themselves. Otherwise, you're just into that kind of nuclear family thing that many people are into. And I am very grateful to do what I do because it gives me that way of having something external to myself that I can identify with and be a part of. And art was my way of doing something, of doing something that would matter. That's a way of not dying.